Hi, and welcome to the second of my videos on the subjects of language and truth. The project today is to develop a simple model of human language use. You can think of the model as a kind of thought experiment, a scenario where there are language-like elements in a society, but not for the purpose of the exchange of information. It turns out that concepts very close, identical perhaps, to the ones we use to describe real language, so truth, meaning, proposition, apply to this model. This, I think, is an interesting outcome. This was the picture of language we entertained, but then rejected last time. So you hear some words, you see something. Your brain assigns meanings to the words. Meanings are compared with your percept, if you like, and your cognitive machinery issues an assessment, harmony or dissonance. Without admittedly going into why, I rejected this picture. If you want to appreciate the kernel of the rejection, please look up convolutional neural network. No percepts or meanings are needed to describe their functioning. There's a deeper reason as well, having to do with difference between causal explanations and reason-giving explanations, but getting into that would take us off track. With this explanatory task off the table, what remains is to come up with a coherent picture of the relations between the concepts of language. So again, meaning, proposition, truth, and so on. And having given up on the picture, we can now appropriate the feelings we might have thought have to explain as a resource to work with. So what components do we need for our model of language? Getting to the model finally. Well, first, we need speakers, obviously. At a minimum, we need at least one speaker of the language. Some treatments of language try to get by with just one, that is to describe the functioning of language entirely in terms of one speaker's understanding and use of it. But no such treatment, to my knowledge, has been successful. The model here will have lots. So now, just to digress a moment, because it's crucial rather to be clear when I'm talking about things in the model, which are stipulated by me and are mine to mess about with, on the one hand, and when I'm talking about reality on the other, about language itself. To be able to make that distinction, I'll put a P sound in front of the model's terms. So instead of speaker, I'll say speaker. Language will become language, and so on. I acknowledge that this will get a bit old, but it is important. It's important for me to make that distinction because the objects of the model are not, in the first instance, the objects of reality. I hope eventually to show that they model the objects of reality, but in the first instance, they're two separate things. So again, that P prefix for everything. So all right, the model has speakers, as many as we need. The second thing clearly it needs is a language. So counterparts either of words or sentences of natural language. Now, a completely natural and familiar thought is to start here with words to try to capture speakers' grasp of their meaning. So these would be words. And from there to work up to sentences. So, for example, you have the name Fido, and you have the dog to which the name refers. And you might think that the right way to proceed is to start in that way. There are perils waiting down this path, well known to people who work on this sort of thing, and I have no insights as to how to traverse them. So the model here will start not with words, but rather with sentences. For the model, these will be just apparently meaningless sentence-like sequences of sounds or noises. So we don't want to be we don't want to cheat by baking in the concepts we're supposed to be explaining. And the model will contain lots of these too. So lots of speakers and lots of sentences. And sentences are, in the first instance, again, just sequences of sounds. Sentence-like sequences of sounds, but just that. All right, so that's two things. The third thing we need is some kind of objective counterpart to language. Again, if we'd been including words, it would have been natural to include the models, the objects, the words in the model correspond to. So again, that's the dog Fido corresponding to the name Fido. However, since we're starting with these sentence-like strings of sounds, the counterparts we need are not objects, but rather the feelings I've been talking about. So to be more specific, the model will contain, for each speaker, a kind of table which assigns to each sentence a feeling. The feeling will be represented simply by a number between 0 and 1, with 0 representing maximum disharmony, discord, and 1 maximum harmony, with 0.5 right in the middle being complete indifference. Since these tables are, or mappings, are the core of the model, I'll formalize them just a bit. Follow the conventional jargon and refer to them as functions, specifically value functions. Nothing hangs on this terminology preference. All that matters, again, is that for any speaker rather, you can find out the feeling which she or he associates with any sentence. Now, because I'll have to refine the function, I'll represent its general form like this. So the value function V, capital V, for speaker I, maps a sentence onto value. So there are as many of these functions as there are speakers. All right, speakers, sentences, value functions. The last thing we need, the last real component of the model, is an incentive for speakers to use language. In a words first model, again, of language, the incentive to talk would be to get information. In a sentences first, feelings based model such as this incentive is not initially available. So solely for the purposes of the model, and this is the first point where the model really departs noticeably from reality, I'll say that when a speaker hears for the first time a valuable sentence, he or she gets a special sentence-related pleasure or pleasure. I'll have to explain this away later at the end of the account of language, but for now, this will be the only reason speakers have to talk. I should also contrast this to the value feeling. So I've got now two feelings. There's the pleasure and the value feeling. The value feeling is meant to be something we perceive and we can easily differentiate, like the feeling, the difference between seeing something white and something black, but not a feeling which has any real great intrinsic appeal. So it's not in itself, the value feeling is not in itself a reason to be using language. That's the role for, again, this for pleasure. All right, so we've got these 4 ingredients, and we're ready to go. And again, just so we don't lose sight of the forest for the trees, my point is that with these minimal components, constrained and modified a bit, which we'll get to, we can get all of the concepts of semantics. You don't actually need anything more than just this to see that the concepts of semantics naturally arise. Okay, so we'll begin by adding straight away 2 constraints on the model. The first is that coming up with new valuable sentences has to be a bit challenging, like say coming up with a new insight. It can't be completely trivial. So pleasure is something hard to come by and something of value. The second constraint is that speakers' value functions must mostly agree, but not completely. You have to be able to count on other speakers to agree with you a lot of the time. But it also can't be completely trivial that they will. So most of the time, but not always. Okay, so now let's get into some of the details. Hopefully it's clear with these bare bones that we've contrived something which has important commonalities with actual language. Because of the potential for pleasure, speakers would naturally come up with new valuable sentences. They would utter their own new valuable sentences to others in the hope of providing a bit of linguistic pleasure. And so, importantly, to get some back in exchange, kind of contract would evolve where you give your pleasurable sentences to others in the hope, in the expectation rather, that they would reciprocate. Speakers who often had new and valuable things to say would be sought out for conversation. Speakers who only ever said the same old tired things, not so much. Right. So now that we have the elements of the model and a couple of constraints on it, the first defining concept can be introduced, and that is the concept of belief. A speaker believes a sentence just in case the value of the sentence for her is greater than 0.5. If it's less than 0.5, she disbelieves it. Otherwise, it's indifferent. Now, before getting to the good bit, I anyway think it's the good bit, there's a basic refinement to make to the value function. If we lapse for a moment back to English, and again, not English, there are, of course, sentences which we value equally pretty much wherever they're spoken. So green is a color might be an example, or 4 times 7 equals 28. Doesn't matter where you are or what the time is, you're going to value those. You're going to be equally inclined to assert them, other things being equal. But what about sentences like "the sun is up"? A person would not, in most places, value this at 1 a.m. To accommodate sentences like this, I propose the first refinement to the model, which is to add a parameter for the place of the speaker and another for the time of hearing of the sentence. Time of hearing or utterance. Take those to be the same. The value function then looks like this. Here, x is a shorthand for a spatial position parameter and t a time. This allows that a sentence may be valuable at one time and place, but disvaluable at another. Okay, so here finally is the good bit, where things really start to get interesting, or anyway, so I think. Returning again to English, suppose Ethel says, "Fred is going to drop by in 10 minutes. And suppose too both that what Ethel says is often true, and that Fred often drops by on short notice. You might take what she says with considerable confidence. You might believe what she says with considerable confidence. But now suppose after a bit of scrolling through Facebook, you come to be confident in the beliefs both that Fred is abroad on vacation and that Gord has been playing pranks impersonating Fred. So you come to be inclined to accept those two sentences. You might then become less confident in what Ethel said, naturally, right? I mean, I take that to be a straightforward fact, familiar sort of fact. The things that we believe are conditioned by other things that we believe, or rather the confidence that we have in our beliefs is conditioned by what other things we believe. To capture this in the model, we need to add an extra parameter to the value function, one which represents the sentences, apart from the sentence immediately in question, believed by the speaker. And we'll use the letter B for this. the value function now becomes this. Philosophers have historically attached considerable importance to the distinction between what are called observation sentences, and to non-philosophers maybe a bit misleadingly theory sentences. An observation sentence is meant to be, roughly speaking, a report of immediate sensory experience. So, it is cold, your hair is black, or maybe the sun is up. Where each of these sentences is meant to be a report of what is being immediately perceived. A theory sentence, by contrast, is one made solely by inference from other facts, or at least not solely by inference, but at least in part by inference from other facts. So, oxygen atoms have 8 protons would be a good example, but also a sentence like the sun is up, if this is spoken in a windowless room, maybe a few minutes after having been outside. The B parameter, so again, the set of sentences believed by the speaker, allows us to make this distinction, which can be captured in second and third definition. So a token sentence S is a pure observation sentence for speaker A, just in case the value of S for A is independent of B. Otherwise, S is a theory sentence. The idea here is that if the speaker is standing outside and utters the sun is up, the token sentence she utters is an observation sentence. If she utters the sentence moments later inside in a windowless room, then her utterance is a theory sentence insofar as if she were to cease believing the sentence, the sun does not rise and set within a space of a few seconds, as I'm assuming she does, she would not value the utterance of the sun is up, again in the windowless room, she would not value that as strongly. Now, it'll turn out that no sentences are pure observation sentences. Valuation of any sentence in the model turn out always to depend to some extent on other sentences. The concept is useful, though, to define a spectrum, if you like, of relative theoreticality or observationality. A related concept given to us by these definitions is of support or support. The support one sentence offers to another. So we can say that sentence S2 supports sentence S1 for speaker A, just in case the value of S1 for A is greater if S2 is in B than if not. This will help us later on when we get to talking about logic. In this vein, we can conceive there to be sentences which are valuable for A solely owing to the presence of certain other sentences in the set B. Remove the supporting sentences from B, and the initial sentence ceases to have any value at all for A. There will be further tweaks, but this in essence is the model. I'll close with a couple of clarifications before proceeding to tease out its implications in the next installment. The first point I need to stress is that the value function is not meant to be a construct whose inner workings can usefully be investigated. A cognitive scientist who conceives of the workings of the brain leading to an utterance of a sentence like "the cat is on the mat," who conceives those workings as the computation of a highly complex function, that cognitive scientist would need that function to take as inputs cat-shaped visual stimulations or the like. So that cognitive scientist's function would have to have a parameter to it with something like those cat-shaped visual stimulations. This sort of cognitive scientist's function is emphatically not what the value function is meant to be. On the contrary, the whole idea is to omit mention any world-specific inputs beyond place and time, and sentences heard or spoken. This being the case, there really isn't anything interesting to say about any hypothetical algorithm which computes the value function. Its point, rather, is more just to, if you like, schematize the components needed to get semantics off the ground. The fact that this is enough, the values, the parameters we've already provided, the fact that they're enough, I'm claiming, is a useful and I think a bit surprising insight. Having made that point, I do want to concede that I'm thinking of evaluations as being determined by computations of the sort, and more to the point, heuristic computations. And by heuristic, I mean involving assumptions that may not have been confirmed, that are really probable, but that are made to speed up the computation and are generally reliable. Assumptions, though, again, which it's known may be false. And these computations, again, are of a sort, but not, to be clear, anything to do with the value function specifically. So a speaker hears a new sentence, what to make of it. All the other things she believes may potentially play a role in evaluating it. But there's only so many milliseconds in the time before a reaction is expected, and we are finite beings after all. So some corners typically have to get cut, and mostly that's okay. So heuristics are all right. In fact, they're probably needed. But, and this is my point, there is the possibility of going back to a past token sentence later on, spending a bit more time with it, and coming to a different evaluation, a new value for it. When you add in that new beliefs can potentially lead to the re-evaluation of previous beliefs, and potentially this process could recur, if you like, you can see that a speaker's set of beliefs would naturally be considered to be in a sort of dynamic equilibrium. We can stipulate for the model that as it happens, speakers' systems of beliefs typically have enough inertia, they're sufficiently stable, that they don't lurch about, they don't typically undergo large-scale upheavals very often. So, in other words, they're mostly stable, but we do want to allow that they are at least a bit malleable. And again, this is provided for in large part by the b parameter to the value function. Change that, the value of b, and you'll change the potentially the value assigned to a sentence s. And once s is changed, it might result in further the valuations of other sentences which for themselves depend on s being in b as well. So the whole process could kind of cascade. But again, it's our prerogative to stipulate that this is limited. So that's the model, and next time we'll talk about truth. Thank you.